We'll get started here. And as I just mentioned a moment ago, I'll be talking about the work taking place at Moscow State Linguistic University in our multimodal communication and cognition lab known as Polymod in Russian for polymodal communication. And with a title like this for a talk, it's a bit grand. Sounds like it's going to be a very big topic, and I kind of feel like I need to qualify it a little bit. It's, some insights into gestures of a certain group of simultaneous interpreters whom we studied in a particular context. So of course, it's not absolutely everything that one could know about this topic, but we'll at least get some insights into this very special phenomenon. And I'd like to start with just a little video clip. This is just something from YouTube.
สภาวะพื้นฐานเกี่ยวกับสภาพจิตของคนไข้ IBD เนี่ยคืออะไรบ้างซึ่งอย่างหนึ่งก็คือคน
So this is a simultaneous interpreter working from hearing English and interpreting into Thai. But it gives you a sense of the kind of work that they do. If they're sitting in a conference setting in the back of the room in one of these booths, and you also notice that she's gesturing while she's talking, even though she's interpreting this person we see on the screen here, she's only seeing her head actually. And it also gives a sense of the context in which they work. So they're in this rather close setting, and with the many distractions, the people on their sides also interpreting and things. So it gives us a picture of what's going on in this complicated work that they do, where they're really multitasking in different ways. They're really dealing with a heavy cognitive load. And this is one of the things that made it interesting for us to start researching. How are they handling this cognitive load of hearing one language and then speaking in another language at the same time, while having to understand on some level what's being said? So this simultaneity playing out on several different levels. We have the time pressure of not having the luxury of being able to think about what they're saying when they're interpreting. It has to come out fairly soon in order to not get behind also in the time stream of the new talk that's coming in that they're hearing. You can also think of a kind of cross-modal embodiment here. So they're hearing this talk, but they're also having to form some kind of mental simulation of what's being talked about. And so this has been discussed in various kinds of research. Semantics is involving some kind of mental simulation of the content of the language that's involved, maybe even involving different forms of mental imagery, which might be part of what we see playing out in gesture. And the environment itself, as I mentioned, working in the interpreter's booth, it's a very particular context because they're also in the bigger context, so like in the lecture hall in the back, but they're an indirect participant because then they're not the one that the listeners are seeing. They're hearing the interpreter if they have the headphones on, but the interpreter is separate from the interaction taking place in the room. So it's a very particular kind of context and raises some interesting questions. This kind of work has been looked at from a cognitive point of view in several ways. NIDA has done a lot of research on interpreting and translating. And we see there's this focus on the message, the meaning of what they want to get across, not necessarily the style in terms of which it was said. And presumably, the interpreter has to form some kind of mental model of what is being communicated in order to talk about it. And so we're going to see how that comes into play in terms of the connection to gesture research. If we think about work by David McNeill, so one of the founding fathers of modern gesture studies, especially with his 1992 book, Hand in Mind, he mentioned there a little bit about how he got interested in gesture research. And in his 2005 book, he also brought it up again. And I'd like to just bring up a little quote here from that book, where he says that in his earlier book, in the 1992 book, he had overlooked two events that influenced him to see language and gesture as intimately tied together. And he said one was a conference in Paris at the end of 1971, where he says, I had something of a language gesture epiphany. The conference was held in a lecture hall, originally set up for diplomatic meetings, with translators at the back overlooking the hall through a glass window from a soundproof booth, like we saw. And he said, what I noticed as I spoke, and he was not speaking about gestures yet, he was doing other research, was a sight that at first baffled me. I could see a young woman behind the glass vigorously moving her arms in an alarming way. She looked to be having some kind of fit, And this thought actually flashed through my mind until it dawned on me that she was translating me into French. The process of going from one language to the other, or just speaking itself, stimulated these movements of her arms. I believe I saw then in a sudden apprehension via this distant yet strangely intimate connection of my speech to another person's movements, that language and gesture were two sides of one thing. So this is where he came up with this idea of the growth point, that an idea unit that develops as we're speaking consists of some kind of imagistic content, but then also has to conform to the categorical constructs of the speech that we're producing in the moment, the linear form of that speech, as it were. So this connection to gesture production, we see it in McNeil's growth point hypothesis, and later elaborated in Kita, Alibali, and Chu's work, where they talk about the gesture for conceptualization hypothesis, saying that maybe gesture is not necessarily connected just to the speech, but it's connected to idea formulation. And that since we're thinking when we're speaking, that then we're also gesturing when we are speaking. But we might also gesture in other contexts in which we're formulating different kinds of thoughts. So in relation to the simultaneous interpreting, we can already see this connection of the idea unit or the growth point that's being rendered in another language as someone else's, essentially having to be reformulated in the interpreter, so kind of reconstituted in a sense. If we take the other side of it and we think of the communicative role of gestures, we know from Adam Kendon's work, he sometimes talks about gesture as utterance dedicated visible bodily action and contrasts that with utterance dedicated audible bodily action. And if we think about who is paying attention to this, so Herb Clark calls us the attender, the person who's seeing or hearing, the one who's speaking or communicating. There's an interesting mismatch here, because if you think of who is attending to what the interpreter says, that's the people in the hall who are hearing the interpreter through the headphones. But who sees the visible action of the interpreter? It's maybe the interpreter, him or herself, that sees what they're doing. But presumably, if they're sitting in the back of the room, not many people are observing them there, at least in this context of the conference interpreting. So there's an interesting, again, context in which to think about interpreting and how it's a strange kind of behavior that then raises interesting questions for looking at speech production, but also gesture production. And there is some existing research on interpreters' gestures. And so, of course, important to mention here, Isabel Gallano Rodriguez's work on going back to 2007 and earlier on pragmatic gestures, for example, in the process of interpreting the role that they play. And also Zagar Galvão's work with her on the conference interpreters working between Portuguese and English, and looking at the degree to which they imitate the gestures of the person whom they are interpreting. And it turns out this really varies to a great degree, which raises interesting questions. Why does it vary among different interpreters? And also more recent work, this is a very recent paper looking at one particular interpreter and the question of what kinds of gestures are they using when they are looking at the screen of the speaker versus looking away from the screen? Does that differ in terms of what they're copying? There's some other work on Chinese and English interpretation with a few more participants in a kind of conversation analytic study. This was Bao Rosé's PhD thesis. And the work today that I'll be talking about is more similar perhaps to this PhD thesis by Stochowek-Szymczak, where she looked at Polish English interpreters, both more experienced and more junior ones, in a few different contexts, and focused on specifically on beat gestures, and was looking at when they saw either a blank screen, so they didn't see the speaker, or when they saw images that were congruent or incongruent with the source text, the language coming in that they were interpreting, what role that played in terms of their gesturing. So a particular focus in that kind of study. And this leads to then the question that we have for the current study, which involves looking at manual gestures and also eye gaze movements by the simultaneous interpreters working in the booth, trying to gain insights into means by which speakers in the situation of cognitive overload and time pressure perhaps are offloading some of this conceptual content. What degree and in what ways do gestures play a role here? And also the differential use of eye gaze, another question as part of the bigger project that we're working on here. So our questions in this project concern what's the role of gesture in these moments of disfluency in particular. So when they're having particular difficulty in the moment, and looking at that both quantitatively and qualitatively. Also looking at the differences in the degree of expertise of the interpreter. So is it someone who has more experience, or are they more junior? Are they a student interpreter? And looking at the quantities and the functions of the different kinds of gestures. And also looking at the direction of the interpreting. So are they interpreting from their first language to a second language, or the other way around? Does it have an effect on the amount of gestures or the kinds of gestures that they are using in that context? So the study that I'll be talking about today is one, as I mentioned, that is taking place at Moscow State Linguistic University, which is quite impressive in the winter and the snow, and was funded by the Russian Science Foundation. This was a grant for fundamental research. And we have our project team working on this, and all of these then from Moscow State Linguistic University, but I can also mention Gerrit Brona, who is here today as well, who has been working on the eye tracking component of that, contributing from KU Leuven. And also special thanks to the Dean of the Interpreting Faculty. There's a whole faculty of interpreting and translating at the university, Ekaterina Pochlukova, for her assistance with gaining the participants, getting access to the participants for the study, both students and alumni of the university, as well as interpreters from working with other universities, Moscow State University, also the Pedagogical University in Moscow, making that possible. So our project involved two different language foci. So one was on Russian English interpreting and another on Russian German interpreting. And the reason we chose these two pairs of languages has to do with some of the differences between English and German, the linguistic differences. So if we think about German and when they have subordinate clauses, and so you have postponement of the main verb, then in those kinds of clauses, we have syntactic differences that come up. So that raised also some questions in terms of cognitive load. Maybe there are differences then between interpreting between English and German, for example. And in this, in our study, then we have groups of more and less experienced interpreters. So about 3 years being the kind of dividing line that was used for these two categories. And actually, we now this week had 2 more of our junior interpreters. So we actually now have 10 of those, making a total of 22. And the materials that they used for interpreting were audio stimuli. So they heard a portion of a lecture. And in the case of the Russian to English interpreting, they heard a portion of a lecture from this website, Postnauka, which is a kind of popular science website with a lot of great material. And talking about on a topic of biodiversity and the extinction of species. So we chose a scientific topic, as has been done in some previous research also, because it's something that people, lay people might know something about, but maybe not a lot of detail about. And also this topic involves numbers to a certain degree. And we know that numbers can be difficult for interpreters, having to get those specifics in what they're interpreting. So we have this, the Russian lecture and the English lecture for the English to Russian interpreting was from a TED talk by a paleontologist who was talking about a similar kind of topic. For the Russian-German study, then we had the same source text from Russian and a comparable talk then in German about a similar kind of topic. And it's important to emphasize here that our participants were then only hearing the lecture, even though we have the audio, the videos of them with the audio as well. We only saved the audio portion for them to hear. And this was because we didn't want them to be distracted or influenced by the gestures in the video. We wanted to see what are they doing when they're just hearing the lecture and trying to interpret it. So how did we set this up? We used one of the classrooms in which the simultaneous interpreters are trained at Moscow State Linguistic University with these the booths around the room, and set it up with a few different cameras. So first we have here our laptop with the audio recording, which they're hearing in the headphones. And then we have one camera, a Sony camera, that's with a view over the shoulder. So you can see the tripod here. The camera would be off the picture here. So providing an over the shoulder view, which then gives us a sense of the depth, for example, with which the gestures were used. On the table in front of them, there's a small GoPro camera placed there. So that gives us a close-up view of the gestures that are being used. And then we also have the eye trackers, which themselves have cameras in them, allowing us to see what the interpreter is seeing in front of them. So taken together, these give us a particular combination of views. So here's the specific combination. So we have from the GoPro camera, we get a close-up view of the speaker's hands. And actually, it's really rare to see in gesture research video that shows you so closely what the hands are doing. So that's a great feature of this setup. Over the shoulder view, giving us the depth seen, and then the eye tracker giving us the view. So they're just looking into the empty classroom. There's no movement in the room, and we just see how their eye gaze is moving around as they're interpreting, which the red line shows the kind of recent tracking of the focus there. I'll be showing mostly the videos from the GoPro camera, actually, because that gives us a close-up view of what's happening. So in terms of the collecting of the data from the participants, in advance, they were given a glossary with some specific terms from the videos so that they would have some of the technical vocabulary that they might need, which is also customary in interpreting settings with the specific kinds of topics. We also gave them working memory tests, verbal and visual working memory tests beforehand, and this was done at a different meeting, usually a couple of weeks beforehand, so it wasn't the same day, for example, so that we could then later compare some of if there are any correlations between their working memory and their interpreting style. We also gave them the language experience and proficiency questionnaire, the LEAP questionnaire, which gives us a sense of their use of the second language and how frequently they're using it and how comfortable they feel with it. It's a self-assessment kind of questionnaire. And then in the booth, they had just a 10-minute excerpt of each of those lectures. So it was the same time, 10 minutes for one direction of interpreting versus the other. And again, no notes or papers. They weren't allowed to bring anything with them, no phones with them, just them sitting in the booth. And afterwards, we gave them a handedness questionnaire based on the Edinburgh inventory, kind of a standard assessment of their handedness, left or right or combination handedness. And of course, we gained informed consent from them for the working memory test and also separately for the interpreting session, and also did gave them a questionnaire, a form to fill in afterwards where they could decide how we use the materials in particular and who could see what, how anonymous it had to be, for example. So then the videos that are being shown today are ones from people who all agreed to have their video shown and also even posted on the internet. Each session then took about 45 minutes in total for each person. And then when we had the video, what we did was put it together for analysis in Elon, so very commonly used software developed by the Max Planck Institute for Psycholinguistics for analyzing audio-visual material using our 3-part videos there. And we analyzed them for both disfluencies, so kind of moments of difficulty in the speech, and also for the gesture functions. And so if we take a look at the kinds of disfluencies we looked at, things like restarts, truncation of speech, use of filler words, dragging out of a particular word. And we also looked at resolutions of difficulties when they were observable. So for example, when there was a stretch of fast speech after having very slow speech before that, or when there was a resolution of a restart or a truncation, for example, because we also wanted to compare, was there some gesture use with resolutions as well as with difficulties. In terms of functions, we looked at typical functions analyzed for gesture, representational functions, pragmatic functions, deictic use, and also self-adapters. And this is something I'll be talking about a good bit. So self-adapters as well as other adapters. So for example, if they were touching something else, like the desk itself. These then were coded for by 3 teams. So the researchers were divided up into 3 different teams, 3 coders in each team. So there was consensus reached within the team about their decisions in the coding. And then we also have cross-coding by another team, looking at particular tiers, the difficulty tiers and the gesture phrase tiers, to then see if they saw other things, did they disagree with some of the coding, and then any disagreements were then resolved by another researcher who then made some final decisions if there were potential discrepancies between codings that were involved. How do we do this in the pandemic? Like so many other people, via Zoom. Thank goodness it's allowed us to carry on our research and conducting our data analysis. We started the project in 2019, and then, 2020, things changed. So this has really allowed us to keep working with bi-monthly meetings. Also, sometimes part of the group meeting in the lab in Moscow, and then others coming together individually. So if we look at the gestures that were used, one general observation we can make is that the interpreters are using types of gestures, the kinds of functions that other people are using in conversation, representation, Deictic gestures, pragmatic gestures, self-adapters. But if we start getting into the details, then we see some interesting differences. So I'd like to begin by looking at some of these details and what we mean by these different categories, to go through each of those a bit. So if we start with the representation and depiction in gestures, using Cornelia Miller's modes of representation as a criterion for saying, this is why we think this gesture is representing, as opposed to doing another function, we see a number of the different modes being used in different ways. So here, for example, is one interpreter where she's having to interpret several numbers in sequence. And interesting also that she's interpreting from German. So if you know German, then you have some of these instances of the 5 and 30 as opposed to 35, so some kinds of syntactic differences from expressing these numbers then in English or in Russian, where you also then have the 35 kind of order. What we see with the text that's in yellow here is where she was using these tracing gestures. Let's see what she does here. She's speaking Russian, so she's speaking, this is what she's saying. And here's a translation into English, which I'll provide each time in case your Russian is rusty, so that you can know what she's saying. So here's what she's doing for this portion.
За последние 10 лет тропические леса сократились на 35%, их было 17 миллионов, и сейчас всего лишь 11 миллионов квадратных километров.
So interesting that her finger then becomes the writing implement to then take down these numbers. And also interesting the timing that we see that this is happening just before she's saying the numbers, that she's been doing this kind of drawing or writing of the numbers on the table. So we have tracing as one kind of mode of representation that was used. Another is sometimes embodying ideas. We see this when people are counting on their fingers. In this case, we have a list of items that he's mentioning, different locations. And so let's see what he does when he's saying those different places.
Можно увидеть, что они сохранились еще, например, в районе Амазонки, кое-где в Азии, кое-где в Африке.
So what we see here is one of the Russian means of counting on your fingers, which is then turning the fingers down on the hand as you go. But this idea that each of these ideas then becomes embodied in a certain way, represented by the fingers that are counting. We then also have other modes, and sometimes the modes interact with each other and work together. So we weren't analyzing in such detail which specific mode was used, but rather was there some mode of representation being used. In some cases, we see gestures that involve what might be called molding, which then perhaps it could also be seen as embodying or enacting something. So in this example, the interpreter is talking about modeling, computer modeling, and he's actually talking about a dinosaur's head and how that can be modeled in the computer. So let's see what he does in this instance.
Дело в том, что моделирование в компьютере.
So we see him, with this these two hands, the curved fingers facing each other, both turning together, giving us a sense that it could be as if you're touching something, like molding it. It could be embodying, that his fingers are the model being talked about, or it could be acting, like as if you're moving something. But the fact that we were able to see some of these modes in this gave us basis for then saying, okay, this is some kind of depiction or representation happening here. So we have different kinds of representation. That's one category. Another big category is the Deictic function, so usually pointing gestures. In this case, the interpreter is hearing a lecture in German. Again, it's important to know he's only hearing the lecture. And he uses pointing then where, again, we have the text in yellow here, so on data and indicated. Let's see what he does here with this.
Вы видите то, что данные потери, они обозначены красным на схеме.
So we see him making two pointing gestures while he's talking about this, even looking up at the kind of imaginary screen that he's referring to there, but he's not seeing any screen, and he's not even seeing the speaker pointing. So this raises some questions, which I'm going to come back to, about the kind of embodying the role of the speaker in different contexts as imagined by the interpreter. There were also different pragmatic functions that were used in the gestures that we saw. Sometimes a basic one is presenting a point. So we know that like the palm up open hand gesture, for example, can be used when a speaker is interactively presenting a point to someone else. Here we see this in a somewhat different way. Let's take a look at this example.
Also, the most popular figure among biologists, when they're asked how many species there are, the biologists answer 30 millions.
So if we notice his right hand there that is resting on his left arm and moving out occasionally when he's making this point here, or in this case, something a little bit different.
We have about 1.6 million.
So we see this two-thumb lift here when he's making this point. And what I discuss in a separate paper is that we might have miniature variants of the palm up open hand that are used in different contexts, especially when your hands are resting on a table in front of you as opposed to standing and talking with more freedom of movement, and maybe serving a similar kind of function of then presenting a point in different ways. In some cases, the speaker was highlighting something that was precise. So here we have a 10,000 years being mentioned, and let's see what the speaker does here.
процентов поверхности суши. За последние 10 тысяч лет мы потеряли почти половину.
So we see the speaker using one of these, known sometimes as this precision grip, something Adam Kendon's written about and others have researched, as if you're holding something small between your fingertips when you're making a precise point, something that was also used sometimes by the speakers. And then even in certain cases, what might be called stance taking. So he's talking about the number of species that were lost in a certain time period and says this was a huge amount, that these losses are enormous. And he does the following.
Это потери антропоцена, потери колоссальные.
So just to show that once more, and if you were watching him looking at the image on the left, this time look at the image on the right. And if you were watching him looking at the image on the right, this time look at the other one, you can also see better what he was doing.
Это потери антропоцена, потери колоссальные.
So we see this little kind of shoulder lift and a head shake. So this kind of little shrug, as it's been researched in various papers. It's combinations, multi-part complex that's involved, which has been also connected with different kinds of stance taking, maybe showing something is absolutely of a certain kind, or there's nothing else like it, for example. And here he's saying how big this number is. So we have different functions for pragmatic gestures. Then another category, which I'll be talking about a good bit, are these self-adapters. And so here you can look also not only this view, but also the view down here to see what's happening.
Approximately 110 species of mammals are extinct, 101 species of birds, and vascular plants, and then crustaceous. And
so we see different kinds of hand internal movements. You see her thumb rubbing the palm of her hand there in different ways. Here's another example, perhaps a little more extreme in some ways.
40 to 70,000 species are going extinct every year. So, how do they get these estimates? They get these estimates by
So we see real tension in the hand shapes and grabbing different kinds of fingers. Sometimes they're also kind of pulling on the skin of the back of their hands. So in different ways, different kinds of self-adapters that are maybe more intense than you might find in a casual conversation. So if we think of the role of these gestures and come back to our original questions, in terms of their what they were doing during these different moments of disfluencies, we see that about 2/3 of these disfluencies were accompanied by some kinds of gestures, but the range per individual was quite large. So it could be that some interpreters were hardly using gestures at all, and others using a great deal. And this is a factor that actually kept coming up in our findings, this big range of between individuals. Most of the gestures serve the functions of self-adapters or a pragmatic function. And here we also included beats, beat gestures as having a pragmatic function for emphasis. Whether it was the more senior or more junior interpreters. And if we look at this in terms of a pie chart, we then see that this kind of distribution of the different kinds of gestures, so blue here being the self-adapters, the pragmatics in purple, beats being the orange gestures. These are the less experienced interpreters. And then looking at the more experienced interpreters, we see a similar, in many ways, kind of layout of these, the use of gestures. But to get into it a little more specifically, was there any significant difference between their use of the gestures, whether they were more junior or more senior kinds of interpreters, or based on the direction in which they were interpreting from the first language to the second language? In fact, there was not a significant difference also in terms of the different gesture categories that we found. But there were some exceptions. So we noticed that the self-adapters were used significantly more by the less experienced interpreters. So this could have to do with this stress relieving function that the self-adapters can have. And we also had a strange kind of finding, which we didn't expect, which is that those interpreting from English to Russian first, so we gave them the task in one order or the other, and half of them did it one way, half did the other way. Those that did English to Russian first and from Russian to English second used significantly more representational and deictic gestures with the disfluencies than those that had the opposite order of the tasks. So this is something we're still pondering in terms of why that might be the case, why when you're going into your first language might you be using more representation and deictics. That's something we can discuss further. But to think of the main uses of gestures, these adapters, for example, we know that they're related to self-regulation of stress, and going back to Friedman's work, for example, in the 1970s, maybe helping to decrease the cognitive load in the moment and helping them gain control over what they're doing in the moment. And the pragmatic gestures, we also know they help structure and organize discourse. If you think of Jürgen Streeck's work talking about speech handling in a certain sense, as if handling and manipulating different ideas. So the interpreters are not only rendering the content, the semantics of what they're talking about, they're also dealing with more abstract categories like information structure and stance, as we saw. So information structure, what's new information, where they might then be gesturing more with the new information, what they're perceiving as new information that they're presenting. And so this was a way of possibly making sense of the prominence of these categories of gesture use. What I'd like to turn to now for the rest of the talk is a few other topics that came out of this project and which we want to look at further. And one of them is viewpoint in gesture use. Another is self-adapters again. So I think of it as a kind of neglected child of gesture studies. So many of us just put the self-adapters aside and say we're not going to research them. But in fact here, they are playing a very interesting role. And the question of gesture profiles. Viewpoint, going back to McNeil's work and then subsequently work by Faye Parrell, if we think of participants in a study who are narrating a cartoon that they saw and telling about what they saw previously, they might take different viewpoints on the characters in the cartoon. So on one hand, they might be using what's called the observer viewpoint, so tracing a path, for example, that the animal followed when it moved. Or they might use what's called a character viewpoint. They might take on the perspective of the character and actually be the animal that they're talking about and show what it did. But Parrell also noticed that in some cases, the speaker is using a different viewpoint, which you call the narrator viewpoint. So like in this case, if the speaker is talking about the character going up a flagpole, but they're using a flat palm up open hand, they might just be presenting the idea in the narration. They're then taking the role of the narrator in that context, as opposed to a different perspective on what happened in the scene in terms of how they're depicting it. So we see these discourse-related gestures, kind of the pragmatic gestures, are doing some interesting things in connection with this narrator viewpoint. And if we think about it in terms of the interpreters, they're in a sense imagining the narrators, the actual speaker in the source text, that person's viewpoint blended with their own viewpoint as they're speaking. So we have this complicated viewpoint blending going on in different ways, which is, again, something we want to look at in more detail. And I'd actually like to come back to it now in connection with the self-adapters. So we saw these different kinds of self-adapters before. There's different, complex hand shapes that get involved and different kinds of tension there. But presumably the speakers, the interpreters, are using the self-adapters for themselves. They're helping with their own effectual state or stress in the moment. So that's coming from their own viewpoint. But then there was something else going on with some of the self-adapters, and I want to give a couple of examples. Here's one example. He's interpreting into English here, I think. Let's see what happens.
And there is also an exotic place like Amazonia, where since 2010 until 2013, there were 560.
So let's take a look at another example, and then I'll discuss why I'm pointing out these examples. Here's another one.
And we have no idea who exists around us, what kind of animals, what happens there beyond the edge. We don't know. Are they dying?
And so what you see here with her with the thumb lifts and the other guy with his also kind of thumb manipulations there, you might have noticed some rhythmic movement going along with the speech. And so in a sense, you have these kind of beat gestures popping up in the middle of a self-adapter, and sometimes in quite extraordinary ways. So here's the interpreters talking about, making a point about how Wikipedia, you might find hundreds of thousands of pages on this particular topic. He does the following.
На самом деле нет. Вы можете взглянуть на Википедию, там сотни тысяч страниц, которые описывают...
And it happens so quickly, maybe you didn't even notice, but his little pinky lift there going rhythmically with how he was mentioning this point.
Там сотни тысяч страниц, которые...
So there's kind of, popping out, even though his one hand is over the other, you still have these little movements that appear, these kind of micro gestures. And what occurred to us is it's kind of like these matryoshka. So if you know these traditional Russian dolls, the wooden dolls, one embedded inside the other, one pops out there, in a sense, this is kind of a similar thing happening. You have the self-adapter as the context, and then in the middle, there's this little pragmatic gesture pops out. And this was something we found happening across many of the interpreters. And so it also raises questions for what do we mean by self-adapters? Is our category more complicated than we thought? These continuous kinds of self-adapters, as opposed to the discrete ones where you're just like fixing your glasses or scratching or something. The continuous ones have separate properties that can make them more complicated. But this also raises questions for this viewpoint issue, because then if the self-adapter is more for the speaker, him or herself, but then the pragmatic gestures are then doing something different, which is what might normally be an interactive kind of gesture where you're then presenting a point to a speaker, there's some complicated viewpoint blending there between the interpreters and, let's say, the imagined viewpoint of the narrator. This is something that we'd like to look at further. The other issue that came up was these gesture profiles. And so I'd like to show two examples here of interpreters interpreting from English into Russian. So it doesn't matter so much what they're saying here, but I just want you to look at their style. Here's the first one.
Следующий аспект я очень кратко затронул, как мы научные методы применяем к таким вопросам. которые относятся не к нашему времени, а к будущему или к прошлому. А в палеонтологии мы не просто находим ископаемые останки, мы говорим о диверсификации, также о вымирании
So you get
видов.
a sense of her lively style of movement and interpreting. Let's look at this second example here.
Было много высказано критики учеными. Допустим, 100 лет назад один из известнейших ученых, физик, он получил Нобелевскую премию, он заявил, что вся наука — это физика, а все остальное — это глупости.
Did you see any movements? I didn't see any movements, and neither did the rest of our teams looking at this. So some interpreters sit with their hands folded. There's also a kind of school of interpreting that then trains them to then do this, to keep their hands folded on the desk, still in front of themselves. The logic being that the interpreter is supposed to be heard and not seen, if they're sitting in the back of the room also, or if they are visible to people in the audience, maybe they don't want to be a distraction from the main speaker. So in contrast to what David McNeil observed of the person gesticulating wildly, so not all interpreters are trained this way, but this is one approach. So some use that, some had these gesture matryoshki, popping out nevertheless, even though they were keeping their hands still. But there was big differences. There were big differences between the styles being used. So what my colleague Olga Iriskanova and others in the team looked at were these profiles of the gestures, laying them out in a kind of spider web here. So if we have different functions of gestures, self-adapters, beats, Deictic, Pragmatic, and looking at the frequencies with which they were used, you might see for this interpreter, for example, they use a lot of self-adapters. Another one used a lot of pragmatic gestures. Another one used a kind of equal mix of those. So this provides a nice way of illustrating these individual profiles. But we see regardless of their expertise, so these were less experienced ones, but the more experienced ones had similar ranges of use. And it reminded me of what Martin Lemons talked about as kind of idiogests, is a term he came up with kind of as like idiolects for gesture, or also what Galvao points out about interpreting style is known to differ per individuals, but you also then can have gesture style that goes with that can differ per individual according to how they're doing their job. So there seem to be really different strategies for tackling this task. So to sum up, we have the self-adapters and the pragmatic gestures being the most prevalent, at least among the interpreters that were studied here. The level of experience did not seem to be a key factor in terms of the differences that we found. And even though we can say that there were more self-adapters by the less experienced interpreters. Viewpoint is then a complicated issue that's coming up with the kind of imagination of the narrator's viewpoint, but it's also dynamic in nature. So it's not just that they're a consistent kind of blend of the person that they're hearing and then their own talking, but sometimes there are moments, for example, not often, but where an interpreter might, for example, have a disfluency and then say sorry and correct themselves. Who is that sorry for? It's for the audience and it's from them. It's not that the original speaker said sorry. So we keep track of the source text and we check, did the original speaker apologize? And so there's sometimes where they're doing this kind of, maybe they can't even help it. They're just correcting themselves and say sorry and then go on, or izvinite in Russian, or whatever what language they're using. So in that case, you have a kind of moment where the interpreter's viewpoint comes to the fore and then goes back into the narrator of the person who's speaking the source text that they're using. So it's this dynamic process, which I think is very interesting. Self-adapters then, so I think these deserve more research in terms of the process of speech formulation, how they're being used. Of course, certain contexts afford using self-adapters more than others. For example, just sitting at a table with their hands on the table, as opposed to standing and speaking. And we see that other gestures might be embedded in them. And I think it's also interesting that this is different than, for example, the kind of sequential embedding that was discussed in gesture phrases by Ladovig and Bresson, where you have a person doing a series of gestures and then does something on the side and then comes back to what they were doing. This is, in a sense, different because the self-adapter is still embodied they're in the gesture while they're doing something else in the middle of it. And gesture profiles, something that we also want to look at more, which these big individual differences between the interpreters and their styles. So in terms of future directions, we have the data from German, which is, as I mentioned, still very fresh. And so we're analyzing that. And we want to look at these same questions about the differences or not between the more and less experienced interpreters, and also compare the results to the Russian English results. And we also want to go back to those short-term memory tests the participants took and see if these relate to these kinds of gesture profiles. We've done a bit of analysis of that, but want to do more. The eye tracking analysis also, we've done a bit of these kind of comparisons and correlations, looking at the moments of disfluency, looking at the frequency of change of the saccades, the change of frequency with which they are moving their eyes in the moment and how that relates to these difficulties and relates to the gesture use. And we also would like to do a follow-up study, if we can get an extension for the grant that we have, which might be possible, to then do a follow-up study where the speakers, the interpreters, are looking at the lecturers whom they are interpreting. So if they do see the gestures, what role does that play? How much are they carrying over those gestures? There's been some similar research by Terry Jensen and colleagues, for example, looking at sign language interpreters and spoken language interpreters, also looking at when do they carry over the gestures from the speakers. So that's something we would like to look at. And there are many other topics that we could look at with these data. They're so rich, there's so much going on there. So I think we'll be analyzing these videos for years to come. Some acknowledgments, again, Russian Science Foundation for making this project possible. A few individuals who played particular roles in helping out with this research, and also the interpreters themselves. Spasibo, thank you very much for all the time they took in contributing to the project. And I would just close with a kind of a commercial here that if anyone would like to be involved or connected or collaborate with research in the lab in Moscow, the group is always interested in international collaboration, so feel free to be in touch. And I can also mention in January, I'll be teaching a one-week course online on gesture analysis. This is for people who know nothing about gesture research, kind of starting from scratch, looking at some of the different categories and how to go about and practically do gesture analysis. If you check it out, the deadline for applications was actually December 1st, but they're actually accepting some more applications, so that shouldn't be a problem. And also I can mention our master's program in multimodal communication in Amsterdam that we have, which could be of interest to students in the future. So I will leave it with that, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thanks very much.